Welcome to Voices of Adoption, where we share unique perspectives, actionable advice, and meaningful stories of birth parents, adoptees, adoptive families, and other members of the adoption community. I'm Donna Pope, Executive Director of Heart to Heart Adoptions.
And I'm Nathan Gwilliam, founder and former CEO of Adoption.com.
Together, we've been part of thousands of adoption journeys over the past 25 years, and we're so glad you're here.
Let's begin today's conversation.
Okay, welcome. We're excited to have you here. We're here with Amy Geller, and we're excited to be with her. Amy is an adoptee, and she was an adoptee in the 60s. Hate to say that because then it kind of ages us.
Well, I was conceived in 1969. I was actually born in 1970, which I know you've talked about the baby scoop era in other podcasts.
Yeah, we have.
Episodes, and 1970 was the year of the most adoptions.
Seriously?
In the history of this country, yes.
The 70s was? Huh.
So the baby scoop era was 1947, like the end of World War II until 1973. The year I was born, 1970, had the largest number of domestic infant adoptions.
Wow. So you're going to tell us a story, but I'll just introduce, because you were a girl being adopted by an adoptive family that with 4 biological children. So in some ways, you're the only girl, you're the only adoptee. So that we want to hear how that kind of played out. So tell us your story. Where were you born? How did your birth mother place you for adoption?
I was born in Rockland County, New York, in Nyack. That's where I was raised. My adoption was a private domestic adoption, kind of a local hometown situation. My birth mother conceived me and had decided to place me for adoption. And my parents, who had 4 boys, had come to adoption because a neighbor / friend had lost a child to Tay-Sachs, and they were advised to pursue the rest of their family through adoption.
Okay. I don't know what Tay-Sachs is. Tell us what that means.
Tay-Sachs is a genetic disease that primarily impacts people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. And it's quite a devastating disease in which you will give birth to a child, but their lifespan is very, very short, often 2 or 3 years. And when 2 Jewish parents of Ashkenazi descent, like there's an increased risk of that. Now we have genetic testing, but so another family that we were friends with had decided to pursue adoption, and my parents decided that despite the fact that they had 4 healthy children, they wanted to keep building their family through adoption and wanted to add a girl.
So what was your reasoning for your birth mom? I know you have been reunited with your birth mom, with your birth parents.
Yeah.
And so you've had the chance to talk with your mom, your birth mom, about this. Why did she place you for adoption?
You know, it's interesting. So at the time in 1970, that was before Roe v. Wade. It was not, there weren't a lot of options for she could have had an abortion, but she didn't really want to. And it was a lot more complicated than it is now. Basically, in order to get an abortion from a doctor in New York State at that time, you had to sort of be declared mentally unwell. And but she has always maintained that she felt strongly she really couldn't do that. And the relationship didn't work out. I now know that my biological father left town. It's interesting. You know, that's one of the things with reunion stories is it can be very hard for adoptees to feel like they get a complete truthful version. I think so much around adoption, the way that adoptions begin is shrouded in shame and secrecy. And so there's a lot of rewriting of narratives, like in chapter 1. But what both of their stories had in common was that he left town at that time. So she decided that she was going to relinquish and place me with parents who were up for the job of raising me.
Mhm. And so you were placed like right away, like first week.
Yes. I I think that my parents had told me there were other couples who were interested in having boys, adopting boys. And so somehow it was kind of understood that my parents would adopt me if I was a girl. And I remember my mom telling me that they had gone through a couple of other pregnancies that had resulted in a male birth. So I'm not exactly sure about my birth mom's perspective on this whole thing. If she was like aware of that, I haven't really brought that up with her, but my parents were very certain they wanted a girl.
Okay. So now you're the only girl in this family of boys. Tell us about when you learned about that you were adopted, what that dynamics felt like, and what it felt like to be the only girl.
So my birth mom uh knew she was relinquishing. She went to the hospital. My parents got the phone call that I was born. Just to go back to your earlier question, I wasn't sure I completely answered that. And for 2 days I was in the hospital. My birth mother never held me. She was separated from me immediately. At the time, I think the thinking was that it was a bad idea to have birth mothers connect or bond or hold their children. Um, and it wasn't until 2 days later that there was a legal handoff and that my adoptive parents were then able to see me. So for 2 days, they could look through the nursery window. And coming home, my parents had sons at the time of my birth who were 12, 10, 9, and 4. So there was a lot going on at home.
I'm sure.
And and yeah, I mean, growing up, it's like hard to pull apart being the only girl, being the only adoptee. There's so many ways that you can look at things. I found out that I was adopted, as many people in my generation will say. I just kind of always knew. I hear that a lot in my work. I don't recall the conversation, but I do, my mom told me that, and I hear versions of this too, that I had this instinctive need to make her feel better. The conversation went something like that: you didn't grow in my tummy, but you grew in my heart. And my mom told me this cute story that I like kind of took her face in my hands and sort of wanted to make her feel better about that.
That's curious why she would tell that story. It's curious both why you sensed as a little girl that you needed to comfort your mom. You don't remember it though.
Well, so for a long time, I would share that story and say, well, of course I'm a social worker. I was, had that in me from a very young age. And I think it was always a story I was proud of. But I will quite honestly tell you that now, reflecting back, it's bittersweet, right? Because a child shouldn't have a sense, learning something so powerful about my own origin, I should not be in a position to feel like I have to take care of somebody else. But I do think that comes up, because I've talked many places about later fast forwarding to when I was 14 and I spoke to my birth mom for the first time. I've told the story many times that I came home and told my parents immediately that I had spoken with her, and the look on their faces was, I mean, just again, I had this feeling like, uh-oh, trouble. And they did everything right, but their faces gave them away before they gathered themselves and said all of the correct things. Panic and look on their faces was so disorienting for me, because my parents were always very confident as parents, very secure, consistent. And now when I had told them this, it's like I knew I had rocked their world.
Okay, well, we've got to look at both of those issues. Let's step back and ask first of all, how did you find your biological mom? How did you do this without your parents knowing?
So many adoptees in my therapy practice will talk about this, like, curiosity or snooping comes up a lot. Sometimes you'll hear, in families, like, kids are stealing or snooping but I actually kind of came across it, I guess, sort of innocently. I went into my dad's filing cabinet to look for a piece of his letterhead. Um, and I saw a folder that said Amy Adoption. And of course, I looked at it. And inside of it were my adoption papers. And I had never contemplated until 14 heard what her name was. It just, I don't know, it wasn't part of the conversation. And now here I'm looking at that my name at birth was baby girl and the last name. And then it was her name and her last name. And now all of a sudden it was like a big part of the picture was in color. So I wrote down her name and I carried it around with me for a while. I looked it up in the local phone book, which some people may remember what those were. And there was only like 3 people in the whole county with that same last name. So I called one of them, and I actually know now who I spoke to because she is she's married to my biological uncle. So we figured out that she was the one I spoke to. And she gave me my birth mom's phone number. Interestingly enough, my instincts, I think, were pretty solid because I didn't call her right away. I carried her number with me for like 2 weeks.
Okay, now we're going to have to go back one more step.
Okay.
So you open the filing cabinet, you look in there, you see Amy Adoption, you pull the filing out and you open it up. I want to hear how you felt.
Stunned, guilty, because I shouldn't have been going through my dad's drawers. If I'm being completely transparent, and I really try to be because I think it's important, I think I had cut school and I needed to forge a note to get out of. So in the first place, Donna, I'm already, ankle deep.
You're in trouble.
Right. So back in the day, you needed to bring a note from home, like signed, or maybe I got a bad grade on a test, whatever it was. I was looking for his letterhead, that I am certain of. And so I'm twice in trouble because I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. And then I found something I shouldn't have been finding. But it was right there, you're
already feeling a little guilty, but you're not sure what you're feeling guilty about.
Right. I mean, I know I'm already in trouble just on a regular day, but now I find this and I'm like, am I supposed to be seeing this? And I mean, I'm putting myself back in that. I'm like putting myself back in that room. And I guess I felt the way you would feel. The way I would describe it is like getting really surprising and upsetting news.
But you knew you were adopted.
I did. And somehow it was like I never contemplated more than that.
I know that whole idea of there's another person on the other end of this adoption. There's my biological mother, and I'm about to find out who she is. Whew.
I also, I think, was really struck by seeing my name, like that I didn't have a name.
Yeah, baby girl.
That really hurt. And I felt just a lot of confusion. I, of course, impulsively did speak with her. I mean, and I say impulsively, so I did carry her number for 2 weeks. And then my best friend and I planned like the whole perfect scenario after school.
Okay, but we have to stop. Why didn't you tell your parents?
That I can't really say. I mean, Probably because I already was in trouble. And
What were you doing in the filing cabinet, they would ask.
that's the first thing, right? And I was already in trouble. And I think had information I instinctively felt like maybe I wasn't supposed to have.
And if in the ideal world, you could have gone, "Hey, I found this," and they would go, "Oh, let's talk about it." But first of all, you were in trouble for skipping school or whatever it is you did.
And then going where I wasn't supposed to go, right? Going through my dad's things. Um, I I was it's actually kind of I'm sad for that version of myself now as we're talking about it, because I was carrying that alone, and basically with the support of my fellow 14-year-old best friend. There were no adults helping us with this.
And so let's keep that in mind to remember when you tell your parents what many things must have flown through their head. And I don't know what they are, and we don't have them here to ask the question, but I can imagine that maybe one of them might have been, "Oh, we should have been there to help her with that." That may have been one of them. It may have been other things, but that may have been one of them. Anyway, go on with your story.
Yes, I really do remember because generally, despite my teenage antics, I was always very close with my parents, didn't have a lot of secrets. And after I spoke with my birth mom that afternoon, we had a short conversation, maybe 20, 30 minutes. I really don't know, because I left my body. I was so nervous. But I remembered that my birth mom said, "If you want to meet me, you have to get your parents' permission." And at the time, I really hung on to that as something worthy of respect, right? That this person was concerned about doing the right thing, and wanted to kind of keep it all above board and not do anything behind my parents' back. So I respected that. And I went home right after and told my parents. It was right before dinner time. And it was like all the air got sucked out of the room for a minute. And then they both kind of took a big gulp and gathered themselves. And, but I can tell you, my adoptive mother was very insecure after that. I sensed it even as a 14-year-old. She took a Polaroid picture of me every single day before I went to school for 2 weeks. And she would say things like, "I just love your outfit today," and there was a lot of extra "I love yous," a lot of, "we love you," right? "We love you." And I remember in my 14-year-old gut, I was feeling like she was afraid of losing me. And I mean, I didn't understand it as much as I understand it now, right? Now to 2025, Amy has grown up and I'm an adult and I'm in middle age and I'm a therapist. And so many of these issues are really quite common in adoptive families. And I think there's that, it's sort of a no-brainer to say that adopted children can have a fear of abandonment. But I think it's also fair to say, I think that adoptive parents have the same.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As an adoptive mom, I understand the feeling, and there certainly is the feeling of abandonment, but there's also that feeling of I'm not good enough, that I'm the second mom, and there's some insecurity that comes with that.
There has to be, right? And I think so much about the process of adoption, because I know that we're having this conversation and all the work that you do and I do is for the improvement of the adoptee experience, the adoption experience. And I think there's so much that doesn't get addressed or talked about. So I, believe it or not, I have found it really helpful when I have an adolescent adoptee that I'm working with in my office and I can bring mom in. And then we start talking about like, what do we have in common? What are the losses? What are the fears? Like, I think as adoptive parents, sometimes the thought is, well, I don't want to talk about why I adopted, or, you know, statistics show that more than 3/4 of adoptive moms chose adoption after infertility, right? That's like the number one reason, although there's many reasons. And yet all of these things are like, we have to just start from right here, from the moment that we became a family. And I think sometimes we're really doing a disservice because there's so much that doesn't get dealt with.
And so when we look back on that moment, they realize you now know who your birth mom is. In fact, you not only know who she is, you've talked with her. Oh, as an adoptive mom, my thought would be, oh, it could go several ways. One is, oh no, I'm the second mom again, or I should have been there to help her, or is she going to leave me? There's a lot of feelings.
And you and I both are moms, so we both know that probably you'd have those 3 thoughts and 17 others
And many more.
all within the space of a second, right? And it's like, so it's interesting. It really is, to hear you say that, because I do think it's not an uncommon feeling to feel like if my child wants to search, I have somehow failed.
Yeah.
Or that you know, that I am secondary, or even regardless of how you come to have a child, when your child goes off and does something so big on their own, it's just, I mean, I remember I shaved my legs at summer camp for the first time. And I know that's a silly example, but my mom was not happy because it's these things like that you imagine your only daughter, like that you're going to be a part of these like things.
Isn't that funny? I remember my mom walking in when I was shaving my legs, and she turned around and I thought, oh, I've done something wrong. And later on, I asked her and she says, well, I just thought it was a little early for you to do that.
It's regardless, there's that developmental thing that our children start to separate and do these independent things. And then the adoption stuff and the reunion stuff just adds like layers upon layers.
Totally. So tell me how they handled it. So they took the gulp and then they said,
how did you find her number? And at that point I came clean with everything. And how was the conversation? How are you feeling? I'll be honest, at that point I was like, what's for dinner? How adolescents are, right? I mean, we are. So, but I did make a very conscious decision at that point and felt that there was positive reinforcement. When I said, I think I'm done, I don't want anything else to do with her, I could tell that was the right answer for them.
But was it the right answer for you?
At the time, probably. At the time, probably. I mean, my mother, who is still alive, she's 93, she has said, now that I have kind of come into awareness, not only that, but like do research, and this is my life's work now. She has admitted it was somewhat naive to believe that this was just a closed chapter. But in 1970 and later, I mean, I work with adoptive parents now who have, preschoolers. I think there's still, to some extent, is this hope, belief, wish, desire that that it could just be a little bit more cut and dry.
Yeah, I think you're right. It could be a little more cut and dry. And the challenge of our job is to be able to embrace the fact that it's not. Embrace the fact that, and in fact, rejoice, I guess you could say, in the fact that there are complexities, that there are multiple levels, that if we choose to delve into those multiple levels, it can be fun, it can be joyful, but it's also very, very scary. And why is it scary? Why are we all scared? Why, as adoptive families, are we scared? Why are adoptees we scared? Why are birth parents we're scared? Why?
It's tough. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of societal expectations that I remember. So when I decided to go back to school, because there weren't a lot of resources, there was not a lot of research. I had started my doctorate hoping to do research on adolescent adoptees, which is really sort of how I got into doing adoption work. But as I learned more about myself in the process, I was like, wow, middle age is a very vulnerable time for adoptees. It is really seems to be a time where many adoptees kind of come out of the fog or come into awareness or basically start to sort of make connections. And I think there's many reasons for that. One is oftentimes the middle age is a common time where we will lose adoptive parents. They're aging, and that can trigger, you know, curiosity, feelings of loss, feeling like now it's okay. Maybe they didn't want to upset their parents. And I think it's just a time where you are examining yourself. It's like a time where you are very open to understanding where you came from. But it is very common that people go along all the way up until middle age and don't have questions, don't think about reunion. Although it's changing now because of social media. I think a lot of younger kids are much more educated and aware. But so I decided I wanted to look at the issues that impact adults because there's a lot happening with adults who are experiencing, wanting to search and all of the stuff that comes up, that comes up with that.
So what's your research showing?
So I did a research study on the experience adult adoptees are having in therapy. Personally, as a adoptee, I have engaged in therapy with clinicians who really didn't understand adoption, who have said things that were harmful. And so I really wanted to know, were other adult adoptees having the same experience? And if they found it helpful, what did they find helpful? We knew that most people in mental health fields are not getting a lot of education on adoption. And if they are, it's about children and kind of like children in foster care. But most people, with the numbers of adoptees in this country and in the world, most therapists are going to work with an adoptee or an adoptive family at some point. And so I expected of the 15 people that I interviewed that they would say, I had bad experiences and I didn't have a therapist who understood adoption. And so through research, I was like, oh, well, I can prove that we need to do better. The results were actually interesting. Yes, some people did feel that they had therapists who needed more understanding. A lot of adoptees told me they had had positive experiences. And this was exciting to me because this is hopeful. What they told me was the therapists who were most helpful were open to learning about this. Like one of the people in my study spoke so beautifully about a therapist who said to her, it sounds like this has really had an impact on you. And why don't we read The Primal Wound together? We'll read a chapter a week and then we'll talk about it in session. Such a beautiful intervention because she was saying, I believe you. And hey, let's go look. Let's look deeper. And it turns out, you don't. Is it great if you are an expert and you know a lot about adoption and you're adoption competent? That's great. But what if you are going to therapy for 5-7 years? You have a really great relationship with your therapist. Now you're 43 and you're coming out of the fog. You don't know what's happening. You may not want to go find a brand new therapist who's an adoption expert. I can tell you the relationship between a client and the therapist is as important as the therapist's expertise.
Mhm. Yeah.
Without that relationship, I don't care how, how many degrees you have and how much expertise you have, you've got to have trust.
Yeah.
And so then from there, I was like, wow, this is great. So I can use this research to teach therapists. Like, here's like the primer, here's the basics, here's just to get you started, because you're going to see adopted people or adoptive parents or first parents in your practice.
And so what would you recommend for those therapists? How do you kind of bring them up to speed?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is this is a time to really sharpen your skills around grief and loss, because adoptive families, they're rooted in loss. You know, there's so much more also, but there's no denying that loss. And I think the first thing I would really want clinicians to know is that regardless of the age, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of why a birth parent is relinquishing, that child has suffered a loss. And that parent has suffered a loss. And most likely that child's beginning in utero, right, was impacted by that. If you are even considering relinquishing or under-resourced or, unsupported, that's going to be a tough pregnancy. And so I think we have to acknowledge that in and of itself is real without pathologizing it. It's like so many adoptees will come to me and they will have so many diagnoses. And I'll say to them, well, what if we just start at the very beginning and we just consider that how you are responding is normal based on the loss that you experienced at such an early age. Now, some clients may never, it's, again, there's no absolutes here, but I think we've got to be, I've heard of therapists who said to clients, but that was a long time ago. Or, right. Or, but you wouldn't have the life that you have now. Those are both true.
But that's not what they need to hear when they're feeling those feelings.
And I'm going to tell you something. I work a lot with adoptive mothers now. My practice kind of goes through phases. And right now, for whatever reason, a lot of adoptive moms are coming to me. And there's so much grief there. And a lot of times I'm like, okay, let's focus on you. And of course, they're just so concerned about their child and what's happening with their child. And all of a sudden, a mom will be sitting there in tears, either remembering, their journey of infertility or even processing the adoption process. I mean, the adoption process is very traumatic, going through that. And a lot of times the clients I work with they've buried that so deeply that when we start pulling that out, it's almost like they forgot. And yet it's in there.
The trauma of going through several failed adoptions, the trauma of feeling like you're the second mom and you're not, the trauma of the money that's related to it, the trauma of feeling like I took someone's child. Those are real traumas for adoptive parents.
I wish we could, so many parents have said to me, I was underprepared for this. And so many birth moms have said, I don't really feel like I consented. It's just so complicated, but we've got to be able to have these conversations like with our heads on right. And it's an emotional subject, And, you know, and then I'll talk to people who are working in adoption and they're like, Amy, we tell people, we try to prepare parents, but, then I reflect back and I think, you know, are you really thinking about, when you're bringing home an infant or a small child, you're really focused in that moment. So and I don't know what it would be like to be prepared for the fact that you are, raising a traumatized child.
I said this to, I shouldn't tell you this story, but I said to one adoptive father, I said, sometimes I feel like I say to people, here, take this beautiful child and it'll ruin your life. and he didn't appreciate my sense of humor right then, which wasn't appropriate. But having been through it now for many, many years and having know the struggle that comes from that, you don't have a clue when you're so excited to have this bundle and this cute little child. You don't have a clue the challenges. But do any biological or adoptive parents have a clue what they're about to step into and how important it is that they get it right and how likely, not likely, for sure, they're going to, at least in some parts, get it wrong and the regret that they're going to feel. It's tough to do that.
When I was doing research for my work at school in the last few years, I uncovered, have you heard of a book called A Shared Fate?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so this blows my mind. So I'm in graduate school, I'm working as a therapist, and I'm researching every piece of literature on adoption going all the way back, having phone calls with people in the field who've written like the biggest books. And I've uncovered this book called A Shared Fate. A Shared Fate came out in 1964. So before I was even born. And it was written by H. David Kirk, who is a sociologist and an adoptive parent. And he did a research study with over 2,000 families. And basically what he said is, we've got to acknowledge that families by adoption are different. We've got to acknowledge that difference, and we've got to have open communication about it the whole way through. And I remember when I found that and that this book had existed, I was a whole host of emotions. I was angry because I was like, this information is here.
Why are we not looking at it?
Why are we not? Now, if you Google this book, and Donna, every time I bring this up in all sorts of spaces, people have not heard of this book.
No, I haven't heard of this book. And we're for sure going to connect it to this podcast.
Yeah. And and he wrote basically that things people don't want to hear. He wrote, we have to acknowledge that having children biologically the typical way is usually the first choice. And to deny that and to not acknowledge that we are raising a family through a different way that requires different parenting and different family style. That was the biggest takeaway from this book. Of course, it would be great if he could give you the steps, how to do it all perfectly. But I just remember thinking, there's the information. We can't say the information wasn't there. I think society is very invested in sort of this idea that it can be the same. And I think that's not fair I don't think that's fair to anybody in the constellation.
Yeah. I just recently went on a trip with my boys and it was a challenge. And one of my oldest son, who's now 25, said to me, 26, he said to me, Mom, we're like a salad. We just are stuck together in a bowl, but I'm a carrot, you're a tomato. But because there's no genetic connection, we're a much looser salad. Now, I don't know how true that is. It was helpful for us because we began to realize we're choosing to stay in this bowl together. And so that's fine. But I mentioned it to my sister and she said, well, look at us biologically related siblings. We're all a bunch of carrots and tomatoes too. And there are differences, but there are differences in biological children, but there is a difference when the genetics are not the same. And we can all admit that. Now, can we all accept that? Can we accept it and then go with it and be happy we're all in the salad bowl together?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think every family is different. I'm seeing this. So I see this, the trend has shifted. People my age, adults, 40s, 50s, maybe even older, who decide to search and pursue reunion, it's often a concern about upsetting their adoptive families. If they are in a bio-adoptive home, and so there's like my family, a mix, navigating reunion with those relationships can be tricky. And then the younger adoptees that I work with, the parents are way more open to the idea of reunion. But often now I find that they want it to happen when the kids are younger. It's like they want to be part of it. And then that's tricky too. It's just, I think it's a lot for us to get around, like our heads around, navigating reunion in a way that feels completely safe, because it's just so scary.
Yeah. And that takes us back to that question of why is it so scary? And I've thought a lot about that. And I'm not sure what the full answer is. I think it comes from our own insecurities. And it comes from our own sense of wanting ownership and that challenge of recognizing that ownership of our children doesn't exist. And shared ownership doesn't really exist because we don't own the children in the first place.
No matter how you become a parent. And that's interesting that you say that. And perhaps this is because I'm an adoptee. Perhaps it's just who I am. But my children, I have 2 children. I have always sort of looked at them as books to be read. Like
Well,
they would unfold. Um, you know, rather than trying to make them.
what you want, form them, writing them. They're books to be read rather than you writing them.
That's right. They're writing their own books, but I see it's a very common dynamic with all types of families, that we have hopes and dreams and aspirations, and some people hope to fix things through their kids, but certainly, like you mentioned earlier, you have more of a chance that your children will be an amalgam of you and your partner, or like you. I think it's very important to recognize that genetically adopted children come from a whole different, line of genes.
Mhm.
That can be tough. I mean, I had an adoptive father who's also a physician tell me it is all environment. And I thought to myself, but you're a doctor. Like surely you have to understand genetics, right? But this is the power of you know these big things in adoption. They can actually make you feel that way.
Yeah.
And I think you want to. I understand the desire to want to believe that, but obviously, it's at some point. Usually, the realization comes that there's more.
Well, and I wonder when you went in and announced this to your parents that you had found your biological mom, if part of the gulp was just that realization that there's more. And we no longer, not control, but just that feeling of, okay, we've got to recognize her independence here and accept that independence. And that's tough for parents to do.
Yeah. So my story went on pause at that point. I did not call her again, my birth mother, and I put it away. And it wasn't until later when I was getting my master's that I was, in my 20s, living in New York City, getting my MSW. And then the grief started to kind of bubble up again. And, at social work school, there's a lot of encouragement of self-reflection and looking at yourself and what issues could potentially, be getting in the way of your work. And so from 14 to 20 something, I had put it away.
You kind of wonder what your birth mom was feeling during that time.
I've thought of that because I sort of disappeared. And now as an adult, I reflect on what that must have been like, to wonder if I was coming back, and also for her, right? We talk about the adoptees' fear and the adoptive mother's fear, but also, I mean, the birth mother who's gone through this huge loss, that has to impact
For sure.
for the rest of your life. I will say, having conversations with birth mothers and adoptive mothers, I think is so important. I do feel like I've learned so much, and it has really informed my work to sit and talk with, people with similar investment, but a different perspective, because we learn so much from each other.
So when you talk with your birth mom, what does she say? So how did you guys get back together again?
14, I speak to her. I don't call her back. Then I was 25 and she reached out to me. And at that point, we exchanged some letters back and forth. And then I didn't respond to the last letter, which I also felt really badly about. But at the time, I was working with a therapist who was very supportive and did encourage me to write her a letter. I had decided at that point I wasn't ready to talk to her or meet with her, but that I could exchange letters with her. And I wanted to know 3 things. I wanted to know about my pregnancy, but when she was pregnant with me, because that's something my adoptive mother could never give me. She could tell my brothers, oh, I craved, cantaloupe, or, but I wanted to know about her pregnancy. I wanted to know about her health history, and I wanted to know about my biological father. And at the time, she wasn't ready to provide those answers in a way that satisfied me.
Interesting.
And I had a lot of anger still at that point. Remember, I hadn't pursued the reunion at that point. She found me. And I do remember, right or wrong, feeling like it was intrusive. And I was at a point in my life where here I was working on individuating from my adoptive family and becoming independent and living in New York on my own. And then she kind of appeared out of nowhere. Now, as an adult, now I look back and say, wow, well, she might have felt that way when I was 14, right? That here she had small children. She was starting her life over. And here I came. And these are, again, important parts of the conversation with reunion. It's very rare that everybody involved in a reunion is ready, has it scheduled. Somebody is usually caught off guard.
Right. The timing, because everybody's going through their lives in their own direction with their own switches, and hitting that right perfect time. It just doesn't happen.
No. So at that point, she had sent the last letter and I didn't answer. And fast forward many years, there was this weird in-between period in my 40s where we had connected on Facebook. And I was friends with her on Facebook. And I'm sure, like, now we hear this all the time. We were friends on Facebook, so I could see her pictures in her life and she could see mine. But like Donna,
You weren't talking.
no. And if we're being honest, social media it's a slice of your life, right? It's what you want people to see. You don't put your hard days, some people do, but most people don't. So there was this strange period where we were connected, and it felt like I just liked knowing that she was there and, like where she was. And then we had planned to meet, and I think it just wasn't the right time. So it didn't work out. Again, also not uncommon with reunions that somebody panics or backs out and then finally, my first year of my doctorate, it was 2022. Here I am, I'm like out of the fog or coming out of the fog. I'm in school doing research about adoption, and I made plans to go to Florida to meet her in person and my half sister. And so I met her less than 5 years ago.
No, that's wonderful. And was it, before we go on, because I want to hear that part of the story, I want us to go back and ask what the fog is.
So I had never heard that term until I was coming out of it. And it is a pretty accurate description. For me, it was being frustrated with things that were complicated and hard for me in relationships. I had been divorced at a very young age, and I had been a single mom and really struggling to find a satisfying relationship. And for years, I'd go to therapy and, I would say, like, why can't I meet somebody who's right? And it was always like, what was wrong with everybody else? And there was this moment where I realized maybe it's me. And I happened to read a book that talked very honestly about the experience of being an adult adoptee. And all of a sudden, I started to connect all these dots. So I'll give you an example. I have a client who today talked about, she went on an online meeting with fellow adoptees. And she said she has never been with adults who had experienced what she had experienced so closely. It's like coming out of the fog is sort of seeing your life in a different focus. It makes me think, so like when kids find out they need to wear glasses, and for like a year they didn't have glasses, but they didn't know. And then all of a sudden they go to the teacher says, your child is squinting and really looks like they can't see. And then you take your child to the eye doctor and they have really bad vision and they put on their glasses for the first time. That's like coming out of the fog.
And we all tell the story about, we put on the glasses and we look at the trees and we go, it's got leaves. We didn't know. So we see things we didn't even know we didn't see.
What I experienced and what I know many people, friends in the adoption community and clients talk about is that there were things all along that would lead people to ask, what is wrong with me? And coming out of the fog starts to answer some of those questions. And it's like, oh, perhaps those things were directly or indirectly a result of my being adopted. I can say it's like, for me, it felt like the ground underneath me had totally shifted. And I, in some respects, was like learning to walk again. And the challenge I find for a lot of adults who come out of the fog is they can barely understand it. And so their adoptive families don't know what to do. And it also, I've sat with so many moms who are like, I don't know where is this coming from? Why is this happening? I thought everything was fine. We got over all of the adolescent, like the hard stuff. Things have been good for 2 decades. And now all of a sudden my adult child is questioning everything and saying everything is about adoption. But that's kind of what it feels like, having been through it.
Can you give us any one specific thing that looked differently?
There was a lot of grief in realizing that. I'll give you an example. So my mother always talked about that when I came home, I was a perfect little angel baby, that I didn't cry, that I was so quiet, slept in my crib right away. And I was always proud of that, that I was this like quiet little baby. But then in doing all of my research, I came to understand that that is often a common response to a child when they come home after being separated from their birth mother, that is actually a sign of infant grief. And to the point where my mom would say, sometimes we thought something was wrong because you wouldn't even cry for a bottle, like you would just lay there. And making that connection that perhaps I was grieving because I had been separated from my birth mom was devastating to me. It didn't matter if it was 100 years ago. It was this connection. I was grieving for that baby version of myself, just realizing that, it had had a profound impact on me.
That it's interesting. And you go, well, now what do I do with that information?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it would be nice to have someone walk it through with you, because you could become angry.
Mm-hmm.
You could become angry all the way around, or just accept that part of you.
I think what's important is, so first of all, now I get to do work with families. I have parents that I'm working with who have toddlers, and they have found me not because there's problems, but because they want to do what H. David Kirk was talking about. They want to acknowledge, right, the differences, and they want to have support and coaching all the way through. So with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, it might be like, how am I going to respond when they ask about their adoption? And it's like being prepared at every step of the way, and also supporting the parents in the myriad feelings that they're having about, uh, I hear things like feeling guilty about separating the child from their mother, or, what if the child grows up and doesn't want to be with me anymore? All sorts of things. And quite frankly, none of them are wrong or bad. We just have to be able to have those conversations. If we could start doing that early, then by the time these bigger things come up, everybody has the language, they're prepared, they expect it, and then, you can communicate.
You would like to say there's got to be a secret sauce, I guess people sometimes will say, in how to make all of this work, and naively say that secret sauce is love, and which it is. But how does it show up? How does it get communicated to people who are hurting? Now, you tell the story about you taking your mom's face in your hand and comforting your mom. Here's this little girl comforting her mom because you sense somehow that your mom is feeling something that's hurting her. And we see that with your mom later on when she feels insecure and start taking the Polaroid pictures of you before you leave. We see that there's the pain there. So what is the secret sauce for you as an adoptee was to love your mom? What do you recommend?
The first thing is, like I said earlier, if you are bringing home a child through adoption, there's got to be acceptance of the fact that you are bringing home a child who has experienced a huge trauma. That I use this example often. It's maybe not ideal, but it often gets the point across. So a reputable breeder of dogs will not allow dogs to be separated from their mother before 8 weeks. because those 8 weeks are vital to the development of that dog's brain and, disposition. But of course, with humans, that's not always available, and that would not be ideal for most people. So we now understand autism as a difference, right? I don't pathologize it. I don't consider it a problem. It is a difference. But when a child is diagnosed with autism early on, the parents usually shift their entire focus to the needs of that child and the family. I think it has to be like that. And so when you are bringing home a child that has experienced oftentimes things you don't even know, right? Because they had a whole existence before they came, even if they came home on day one, while they were pregnant, right? In utero. So I think there has to be a shift in acknowledging and accepting this is different. This is different. And the parents have different needs. The child has different needs. We've got to stop like jamming this idea that it's the same. First of all, we have to stop like qualifying it and quantifying it, because, I'll hear things like it's just as good. Love is enough. And, love is amazing. Everyone needs love and consistency and security and safety, but it doesn't fix everything.
No. And how love is shown can vary so much.
I'm going to also say something though that, I have to be honest about. Most of my work with adoptees, when it is most effective, it is with the adoptive parents. I will tell you, even if I had the most amazing therapist who was like the fantasy therapist that I could create for myself across my lifespan as a child, I don't know if it would have made much of a difference, because I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I will say I have had lots of parents bring their kids to me and with the best of intentions and say,
fix them.
Not even that. Better than that. They will say, I'm open. I'm reading the books. I want to understand. Help us as a family, right? Which is a much better approach. And the kids are like, often aren't ready to explore this. So I find the best approach is really working with the parents to kind of work through their own loss, their own grief, everything they're bringing into the situation. And it just prepares you for later on, for if and when harder times come or reunion comes, or I will say, no matter how old your child is, when when an adopted person is curious and wants to search, it's often a time that causes a great disruption in the adoptive family and sometimes leads to estrangement. We're seeing more and more of that. And like you said, I think it's everybody's afraid and no one knows what to do.
This is such a great conversation and something we so deeply need. I'm going to have to, and I'm going to ask, would you be willing to come back again?
Sure, of course.
Could we, because you're going to be thinking about this more and I'm going to be thinking about this more. And I'd like to come back and actually address specific issues that we might address to adoptees, birth mothers, and adoptive families, how we could specifically advise them. One of the first questions that comes to my mind is, you just said that working with adoptees maybe works the best with adoptive families.
Mm-hmm.
And I immediately thought of my kids and thought, even if they're adults? And that's what I thought, is if I were to go in with my adult children to explore some of these issues, rather than send them to go explore them myself? Would that be a better plan?
I will tell you, at the bottom of all of my emails, I say this all the time. I have a sign in my office. It says connection is everything.
Mm,
We know that we heal through connection, through relationship, through relatedness. And so what is broken often in adoptive families is attachment, right?
for sure.
And so we can't heal attachment alone.
I'd love to have you back for another episode if you're willing. And in that one we would probably go on, I would hope, to explore specific things that members of the constellation can do to develop this connectedness, including coming to therapy together.
Mm-hmm.
Amy, thank you so much for being with us, and let's be back together again soon.
We'll talk again, Donna.
Okay, take care. Bye. Thank you for listening to Voices of Adoption. I'm Donna Pope.
And I'm Nathan Gwilliam. Every voice in the adoption triad deserves to be heard and understood.
Visit voicesofadoption.org to subscribe and access additional resources. And then join us next time as we continue to build bridges through conversation.